You know that feeling when something just doesn't sit right, but you ignore it because it seems too trivial. That's where this all started. I was traveling alone for a work conference in a small town in upstate New York. The company budget didn't allow for any high-end hotels, so I settled for a cheap, no-frills place on the outskirts of town. The pictures online made it look passable, nothing special, but good enough for a few nights. The reviews were mixed, with some people mentioning strange noises and odd occurrences, but I figured they were just exaggerating. I mean, how bad could it really be? When I arrived, the place looked more run down than I expected. The photos had clearly been taken years ago, and time hadn't been kind to the hotel. The lobby was dimly lit, and the carpet was threadbare. The clerk, an elderly man with a vacant expression, handed me my key without a word. There was something off about him, but I chalked it up to his age and shrugged it off. My room was at the end of a narrow, eerily quiet hallway. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice the peeling wallpaper and the faint, musty smell that hung in the air. Once inside, I did my usual routine, unpacked, set up my laptop, and tried to get some work done. The room itself was as disappointing as the rest of the hotel. The furniture was outdated, the bed looked lumpy, and the walls were scuffed and worn. But I didn't care, I just needed a place to sleep. By 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I woke up sometime later to a loud, rhythmic banging noise. It was coming from the room next door, relentless, like someone was repeatedly slamming something against the wall. Groggy and annoyed, I considered calling the front desk, but figured it was just some inconsiderate guest. I told myself it would stop soon, but it didn't. The banging continued, growing more unnerving by the minute. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was impossible. Just as I was about to get up and complain, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint whispering coming from the hallway. The words were barely audible, but I could make out help and please in the hushed tones. My first thought was that someone needed assistance, but when I peered through the peephole, the corridor was empty. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the low hum of the old heating system. I returned to bed, feeling uneasy but too exhausted to dwell on it. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The door to my room was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it tightly before going to sleep. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as my own forgetfulness. At breakfast, I casually mentioned the noises and the strange happenings to the elderly clerk. He just gave me a non-committal nod, his expression unreadable. The rest of the day was spent at the conference, where I tried to forget about the previous night. But when I returned to my room that evening, something else was off. My laptop, which I had left on the desk, was now on the bed. I hadn't touched it since I finished my work the night before. That night, I was more cautious. I double-checked the door, made sure everything was secure, and tried to get some sleep. But around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash from the room next door. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. My heart raced as I lay there listening. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I was too terrified to move, praying that whoever or whatever was out there wouldn't come to my door. Then the scratching started. It was coming from the closet, soft at first, then growing louder, more frantic. It sounded like something was desperately trying to get out. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, turned on the light, and yanked open the closet door. But there was nothing there, just a few old hangers and some dusty blankets. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could. As I checked out, I asked the clerk if there had been any issues with the rooms. He looked at me with a somber expression and said that sometimes guests reported strange experiences. That was all he offered, no explanation, no comfort. Later, I did some research on the hotel and found out it had a dark history with a string of accidents and unexplained events tied to it. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that room, and I'm just glad I never have to go back. But the memories still linger, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that faint, desperate scratching. It was a chilly October night, years ago, when my friend Tony and I found ourselves on the road, heading back after an adventurous trip. We hadn't planned on stopping, but the fatigue from hours of driving weighed on us, and we knew we wouldn't make it home without some rest. The next town was small, unremarkable, and eerily quiet as we pulled into a dimly lit motel. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. After checking in, we decided to unwind in the motel's hot tub. The night was crisp, and the steam rising from the water seemed to beckon us. The pool area was deserted, save for a few moths fluttering around the flickering lights. The pool itself was closed, a sign indicating it was undergoing chemical treatment, but the hot tub was still open, and that was all we needed. As we sank into the warm water, the tension from the road melted away. We talked about the day's adventures, the places we'd seen, and our plans for the next day. The night sky was clear, the stars bright against the velvet blackness, but the dim lighting around the hot tub cast long, unsettling shadows. Our conversation drifted to lighter topics, old stories from high school, inside jokes when Tony suddenly fell silent. I followed his gaze and noticed a figure standing at the edge of the pool area. At first, I thought it was just another guest, maybe someone looking to take a late night swim, but something about the way they stood there completely still sent a chill down my spine. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Tony, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, eyes narrowed as he tried to make out the figure in the darkness. The person was tall, dressed in dark clothing, but their face was obscured by the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there watching us. We tried to ignore them, continuing our conversation, but it was impossible to shake the feeling of being observed. Minutes passed and the figure didn't budge. The longer they stood there, the more our unease grew. Finally, Tony called out, asking if they were waiting for the pool. His voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. The figure didn't even flinch. "Maybe we should head," and Tony suggested, his voice low. I nodded, agreeing that it was time to call it a night. As we started to climb out of the hot tub, the figure finally moved. But instead of approaching us, they turned slowly and walked away, disappearing into the darkness with deliberate, almost mechanical steps. We stood there for a moment, watching the spot where they had vanished before hurriedly gathering our things and heading back to our room. Once inside, we locked the door, securing the chain for good measure. We tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to some local weirdo, but the unease lingered. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it was restless. The next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to put the strange encounter behind us. As we checked out, the front desk clerk barely glanced at us, and we didn't mention the figure from the night before. We were just ready to leave. A few days later, Tony sent me a news article. A man had been found dead near the motel, his body floating in the pool that had been closed for maintenance. The police ruled it an accident, saying he had been living in the woods nearby and had a habit of sneaking into the motel's hot tub late at night. The details were eerie, but what unsettled me most was the picture they included of the man. Though I had never seen the figure's face that night, something in the back of my mind connected the dots. To this day, I can't be sure if it was the same man we saw, but the memory of that cold, silent figure standing in the darkness haunts me. Whether he was the victim or something far worse, I'll never know, but I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out. You never think much about the night shift until something happens that you can't forget. That's how it was for me, working the graveyard shift at a small, out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town. It was usually quiet, just a few late check-ins, maybe a call or two. But this one night was different. It all started with a phone call at 1 a.m. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "I need a room," it said. I glanced at the reservation system, but we were fully booked. "I'm sorry, we don't have any vacancies tonight. Do you have a reservation?" I asked, expecting them to hang up. There was a pause, long enough to make me uneasy. "It's important," the voice finally said, but nothing more. I explained again that we were fully booked and suggested a few nearby hotels. The line went dead without another word. An hour later, the front door creaked open, and in walked a man I hadn't seen before. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes, There was something unsettling about his eyes. He didn't say a word as he handed me a crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it and saw a room number scrawled on it, -217. Beneath the number were the words, "I need this room. No one else should know." A chill ran down my spine. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but room 217 isn't available right now." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick stack of cash, slamming it down on the counter. His eyes met mine, daring me to take it. My unease grew, but I held my ground. "I can't help you without an ID or a reservation," I said firmly. "You'll have to leave if you don't have either." He stared at me, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. I watched the security monitors for a while after that, but everything seemed normal. Still, the encounter left me on edge. At 3 a.m., a loud bang echoed from upstairs, making me jump. My heart pounded as I grabbed the master key card and headed up to the second floor. As I approached room 217, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My hand shook as I pushed it open a little further, peering inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. But even in the dim light, I could see that something was wrong. The bed was a mess, the sheets tangled and thrown aside. On the floor, a handkerchief lay crumpled, stained with something dark, too dark to be anything but blood. I took a step back, my pulse racing, and that's when I saw him, the man from earlier, standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. Panic surged through me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I bolted downstairs, my feet barely touching the steps, and called the police. When they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the motel, but there was no sign of him. Worse yet, when they checked the security footage, the video from that time was corrupted. Nothing but static and glitches. In room 217, they found nothing except that blood-stained handkerchief. No explanation, no answers, just more questions that would never be resolved. I left that job a couple of months later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there watching, waiting. Even now, I still think about that night, about the man and his cryptic message. And I'm haunted by the thought that somewhere out there, he's still looking for room 217. There's something about the last night of a trip that makes everything feel more intense, like it's your last chance to make memories before reality sets back in. My friends and I were in the heart of Mexico City, wrapping up a week of exploring and partying. We had splurged on a decent hotel, nothing too fancy, but comfortable and right in the middle of all the action. After a wild night out, we stumbled back to our room, still buzzing from the energy of the city. It was late, really late, but we didn't care. We kept the party going in our room, laughing, drinking, and reminiscing about the week we'd had. That's when it happened, the first knock. It was loud and sudden, cutting through our drunken laughter like a knife. We all froze, our eyes darting to the door. My buddy Ethan got up to check the peephole, but when he looked out, there was nothing, just an empty hallway. We all chuckled nervously, assuming it was just someone messing with us because we'd gotten a bit too loud, so we quieted down and started getting ready for bed. But then, another knock, this time more insistent. My heart started to race. We knew we weren't making any noise now, so why would someone be knocking again? Ethan checked the peephole once more, but this time there was someone there. A man just standing outside our door, staring right at us through the tiny glass. We all took turns looking, our unease growing with each glance. The guy didn't move, he just kept knocking, waiting for us to answer. Finally, my friend Lily spoke through the door, asking what he wanted. His reply was calm, almost rehearsed. He said he had found a wallet one of us had dropped at the club earlier that night. We immediately started rummaging through our bags, checking our pockets, but everything was there: wallets, IDs, all accounted for. My stomach dropped as I realized that this guy wasn't here to return anything. Lily told him we weren't missing anything, but the man didn't leave. He just stood there, silent, like he was waiting for us to open the door anyway. The tension in the room was suffocating as we tried to figure out what to do. We decided to call the front desk, asking them to send someone up to deal with this guy. Minutes later, 2 hotel staff members arrived and tried to get the man to leave. But instead of backing off, he snapped. He started swinging at them, fists flying wildly. The staff managed to wrestle him to the ground, but it wasn't easy. He fought them like a man possessed. Eventually, the police arrived and hauled him away. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. This guy had followed us from the club, watched us, and tried to get into our room under the guise of returning something we never lost. I still get chills thinking about what might have happened if we had opened that door. That night, I realized just how vulnerable we really were, even in the supposed safety of a hotel room. It was the kind of storm that makes you feel small, as if the sky itself is trying to wash you away. My friend Lena and I were supposed to be camping that night, but the rain had other plans. The weather reports had warned us, but we were stubborn, thinking we could tough it out in our tent. But when the thunder started to roll in like a freight train, we decided to find shelter. We ended up at this rundown, nameless motel in the middle of nowhere in rural Montana. It was the only place for miles, and the flickering neon sign out front was like a beacon in the storm. The man at the front desk looked like he hadn't seen a customer in years, with a blank expression and eyes that seemed to stare right through us. But we were desperate, so we paid for the room and hoped the roof wouldn't leak. The rain started to pound against the windows. As soon as we closed the door behind us, we tried to make the best of it, drinking cheap wine and playing cards as the storm raged on outside. By midnight, the storm had become a steady rhythm, lulling us to sleep. Sometime in the early hours, I woke up, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had stirred me, but the room felt different. That's when I noticed that the thin line of light slicing through the darkness from the door. It wasn't supposed to be there. The door was cracked open just as far as the chain lock would allow. A shiver ran down my spine as I saw the hand, pale and bony, reaching through the gap, fingers twitching as they fumbled to unlatch the chain. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced over at Lena, still asleep, unaware of the horror unfolding just feet away from her. Without thinking, I sprang out of bed. My mind was a blur, but my body knew what to do. I slammed my weight against the door, crushing the arm between the door and the frame. A guttural grunt came from the other side, and the hand retreated, disappearing into the shadows. Lena shot up in bed, startled by the noise. I whispered to her to call the police, my voice trembling as I kept my body pressed against the door, half expecting the intruder to try again. It felt like hours before I heard the distant wail of sirens, though it was probably just minutes. By the time the police arrived, the storm was dying down, but the dread that hung in the air was thick. The officer asked if we had seen who it was, but all I could do was shake my head. The man from the front desk appeared, rubbing his arm, and claimed he hadn't seen a thing. But there was something off about him, the way he cradled his arm as if it were injured. It didn't take a detective to figure out that something wasn't right. We told the cops our suspicions before we left, not waiting to see if they'd follow up. We just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As we drove off into the early morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man at the front desk had been the one trying to get into our room. I don't know if they ever caught him, but the thought of his injured arm gave me a small sense of justice. Maybe, just maybe, I had hurt him enough to stop him from trying it again. But as we continued our journey, the thought lingered, what if he found someone else who wasn't so lucky?